The combination of the effects of COVID-19 and the disproportionate amount of African Americans who have been killed by the virus, plus the ongoing systemic racism in this country, as well as the incessant violence by law enforcement against African Americans, has been a deadly concoction. And those issues are exacerbated when you juxtapose those issues with the prison industrial complex. And a couple of statistics really bear these issues out. A 2019 study by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America concluded that about 1 in every 1,000 black men can be expected to be killed by police. That's compared to the general population and its odds, which is 1 in 2,000. And a 2018 survey by the nonprofit FWD.US in conjunction with Cornell University found that 64% of U.S. adults have had an immediate or extended family member spend time in jail or prison. And of that, Black adults are 50% more likely than white adults to have immediate family members incarcerated and 3 times more likely to see a loved one imprisoned for longer than a year. It is almost unimaginable to think that anybody in the middle class is not affected by that, whether you are an African American or an ally for Black Lives Matter. And joining us right now on the A Lot of Sports Talk podcast to talk about a number of these issues is Eliza Orlins. She is a public defender in Manhattan and has been for a decade, and as of a few months ago, officially a candidate for Manhattan District Attorney. The Democratic primary for the Manhattan District Attorney spot is next year in 2021, March of 2021. First of all, Eliza, thank you so very much for joining us here today. And I know this is usually a throwaway question, but given everything that I just mentioned with COVID-19, with everything that has happened in the past couple of months, from the George Floyd incident, Ahmaud Arbery, Charles Cooper, Breonna Taylor, and everything that has spawned after that, this is not a throwaway question. How are you doing?
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for asking. I'm okay. I mean, this is truly, we are living through this tumultuous political moment, a global pandemic, and all of the, horrific killings of Black men and women by police officers. So I think that that's something that's been going on for centuries, and I think that the fact that this is really coming to light now and people are saying, okay, we can no longer stand for this, makes me feel, I guess, a little bit hopeful despite everything terrible going on. I think it's encouraging to see so many people out in the streets. It's been almost 3 weeks of everyday protests here in New York City, and so I'm hopeful that we will, take on real change after all of this is over.
You've taken to the streets in these past couple of weeks, a couple of days, where you have live streamed from different protests and different events. From your perspective, and I know there have been many people, many organizations that have reported on it, and some organizations that have reported on it in a way that might be and is misleading. What was your experience when you were out on those streets, in the streets of New York City on those days where there were protests and demonstrations?
I have been out protesting almost every day since May 30th, which was a week after the murder of George Floyd and the Christian Cooper incident on Memorial Day. And I have seen almost entirely peaceful protests. The only kind of negative interactions I've seen have really been when the police have escalated things to violence. Most protesters are out being vocal, speaking out, using their First Amendment right to take to the streets and protest the horrific, conditions of what's happening in America with police brutality and violence and murder. And I think that even nights that we stayed out past curfew, when I was in areas that did not have heavy police presence, I saw, no violence, no, looting, and people are saying those things like, oh, well, look at this is so terrible. But it's really, that detracts from what is actually happening, which is people are, fighting against the horrible racist systemic oppression that exists in our country. And so I think that we can't allow that to take any of the focus away from why we are out in the streets every day.
One of the buzzwords that has emerged in the past few weeks and programs or potential program is the Defund the Police campaign. And it can be misleading, and there are organizations that have intentionally made that phrase misleading. I just want you to explain what Defund the Police is for us through the lens of what you might propose and what you think is the best way for New York City to possibly defund the police, which is actually really, here's a skeletal explanation for it, just a reallocation of funds from the budget to the New York City Police Department, which is $6 billion, and reallocate some funds to programs whose workers are more equipped to handle high stress and emergency situations compared to stretching the police force even more than stretching them thin and having to deal with those situations. So are you an advocate of the defund the police mantra and what it aims to do, and how would you, if you're in favor of it, implement that through the lens of the New York City budget and in New York City?
Well, as you said, billions of dollars, billions with a B of dollars, are invested into surveillance, punishment, and policing. And instead of fostering equitable, healthy, and safe communities. And so for years, our country has criminalized addiction, has criminalized poverty to the tune of, 10 million arrests a year, and mass incarceration has not provided people with public safety. And I think that our criminal legal system should focus on the perpetrators of real harm, and not on people who commit petty crimes and we're removing productive citizens from society. And I think that it's quite clear that we need to reallocate the funds that have been used on policing to support people and services in marginalized communities. So it's not just thinking about putting that money into schools and hospitals and libraries and mental health initiatives and youth violence programs and after school programs, and there's so many things, homeless services, job training. There's so many things that we need to be investing in as opposed to into police forces. And unfortunately, as Manhattan District Attorney, I won't have the ability to unilaterally make decisions as to funding, especially not as it relates to the police. But I think that as Manhattan DA, I will be a force for safety without fear and justice without overreach. So I think it's this new vision for New York, and I think that the last few weeks have shown us that this is truly what we desperately, desperately need. And I think that the police responding to issues when someone's in the throes of a mental health crisis, when someone is dealing with other with other issues, that we shouldn't be sending in armed police officers who typically escalate a violent encounter rather than, sending in social workers.
Once again, Eliza Orlins, public defender in New York City and candidate for Manhattan District Attorney, joining us right now on the A Lot of Sports Talk podcast. You mentioned something that I wanted to hit on really about not necessarily, punishing those who commit petty offenses and really crushing them in the system that we currently have. In 2019, the New York State Legislature passed a pretty progressive cash bail reform program where it abolished bail for a number of misdemeanors and nonviolent acts. And then to begin this year, the NYPD pointed to numbers that said that there was a spike in crime and attributed that to that reform in 2019. And then there was a big rollback on that just a couple of months ago, a big rollback to that progressive cash bail reform that had been passed in 2019. I'm sure you would attribute a number. I'm sure you would attribute a factor of that rollback to fear mongering. But how do you get back the momentum to get to the point where we do have this more progressive cash bail reform system that I'm sure you would say would benefit a lot of people, law enforcement and citizens as well?
Absolutely. I am 100% in favor of ending cash bail. Cash bail does nothing except for perpetuate the biased and racist nature of our criminal legal system. People of color are far more likely to have higher bail set on them, to be held in pretrial detention. And this means longer pleas, longer prison sentences. And the only way to break the status quo is through transformative change, which New York started kind of to do in this reform of the cash bail system. And bail has never kept us safe. The purpose of cash bail is to ensure someone's return to court, but all it has ever done is detain people who are not wealthy enough to buy their freedom. So we say you are innocent until proven guilty in this country, but that really only applies to people who are of means, because people who can't afford to pay their bail can sit in jail at Rikers Island here in New York for days, weeks, months, or even years, waiting to see if they are even convicted of a crime. Sometimes maybe they take a plea just in order to resolve the case and get out of jail. We see better outcomes in cases where people are at liberty, and the majority of people come back to court anyhow. And so it makes sense. And the data shows that if someone is locked up for, even if it's just a period of 3 months, 3 weeks, or 3 days, that they are exponentially more likely to reoffend or get rearrested. And it makes sense, because if you think about it, then the person could lose their home, they lose their job, they lose their children to foster care if they're a single parent. People could lose everything they've ever worked for being locked up just for a matter of days. And so I think it's extremely important to end this system of wealth-based detention.
You mentioned Rikers Island, and at the very top of this interview, I mentioned the effects of COVID-19. Right when COVID-19 was really starting to gain a grip here in the United States, late in February and then in March, there were stories from Rikers Island and other prisons and jails about the dire situations in those institutions with COVID-19 running rampant, especially in those prisons in Rikers Island. You were someone who was voicing that and immediately and talking about it right as those bits of news broke out. Now that it's a couple of months in, what are you seeing? What are you hearing now in terms of the situations in prisons as it relates to COVID-19? And how can those situations, if they are still dire, which I'm sure some of them are, because of outbreaks in cities that have started in prisons, how do we get to the point where we can improve those situations in prisons in relation to COVID-19 and just in general?
So the rates of infection of COVID-19 in jails and prisons were exponentially higher than in cities in general and in the country as a whole. At Rikers Island, I think it got up to about 10 times the rate of infection of New York City. And New York City had a pretty high rate of infection at that point. And we're seeing cities and states be able to flatten the curve, but in our jails and prisons, we are still seeing very high rates of COVID infection. And it's kind of not that surprising because people entering our jails and prisons are among the most vulnerable in society anyhow, and incarceration only exacerbates that. We're seeing people, this was already a public health crisis, whereas we're seeing overcrowding in cells. There's no ability to social distance. People oftentimes don't have soap. Hand sanitizer is literally contraband in jail and prison because it contains alcohol. There are 30 to 40 people sharing one toilet. People are sitting shoulder to shoulder at mess halls, eating off of dirty trays and plates. And so, of course, anything that is, they're petri dishes. So anything that is very highly contagious gets spread like wildfire in a jail or prison. And so we were seeing that disease was just spreading, very, very rapidly in jails and prisons. And sadly, that's not some, outlier. We saw, early on when I was a public defender, I remember there was a TB outbreak at Rikers Island, and it just kind of went, everybody's coughing, and it just went kind of, it spread very quickly. And I think that this is so important to think about, because when people say, oh, well, it's people in jails and prisons, well, the boundaries between jails and prisons in our communities are porous. It's not like coronavirus says, oh, okay, this is the inside of the jail and that's the outside. I mean, there are people in and out, in and out. So we're seeing correction officers get infected at very high rates, bring the infections home, infect their families, infect their communities. Everyone is being transported to the same hospitals. And so these, our fates are inextricably intertwined. And so I think people need to really consider that and think about the fact that the current Manhattan District Attorney, Cy Vance, continues to send people to Rikers Island and to hold people there, even without providing corroborated evidence or grand jury testimony or have a preliminary hearing to actually substantiate the charges against people. And so, we need a DA who will decarcerate and who will take these things into account and think about the human cost of this when thinking about these issues.
You mentioned the current district attorney, Cy Vance, in Manhattan, and you mentioned just something right now that you believe was a shortcoming of his. Do you think that is his biggest shortcoming and the main reason why you are putting your name and in the hat and running against him and for district attorney?
Cy Vance has so many shortcomings that it's hard to pick just one or even the biggest. But basically, he's someone who has perpetuated this kind of two systems of justice. Basically, you probably have heard people say, oh, our criminal justice system is broken. But I tell them it's not. It's in fact working exactly as it was designed, which is to marginalize people who were already from marginalized communities, people of color, LGBTQIA folks with disabilities, people who are just working every day to try to make a paycheck and provide for their families, while giving breaks to the rich and powerful, while allowing people like Harvey Weinstein and Jeffrey Epstein and the Trump kids to face no accountability for their actions while locking everyone else up at very high rates. So I think that Cy Vance is someone who, his system of justice has not been justice for all. And I think that there's so many reasons why I'm running against him, but truly figuring out a way to create a fair and just system that also keeps us safe is my biggest aim.
Once again, Eliza Orlins joining us, public defender in New York City and district attorney candidate for New York County, Manhattan. The primary is in 2021. Last year, there was a very spirited district attorney race in Queens, and a colleague of yours, Tiffany Caban, ran a very spirited race. And for a short while, it seemed that she was the winner of that race. And one of the platforms against Melinda Katz back in 2019. And one of the platforms that Tiffany Caban has is decriminalizing sex work. Is that something that you agree with her and other people who believe that sex work should be decriminalized, and why?
Absolutely. We need to decriminalize sex work. It is so important that we decriminalize. And when I say decriminalize sex work, I mean consensual sex work. And I mean consensual sex work, not just for those who are selling the sex, but those who are buying it. Because all we serve to do by criminalizing this work that people are engaging in is make them, people who are already vulnerable, more vulnerable. We force them underground. We allow them to be terrorized by the police. And we allow the people who are perpetrating real harm, people who are traffickers, people who are committing violence against sex workers or violence against women or, trans women or, whoever is trying to just do their job. They're not held accountable because people are too afraid to report, to seek help, to do anything because they're forced underground due to the criminalization of sex work. And I think that, just like the failed war on drugs, the war on sex work has really just been a war on people. And it has predominantly affected people of color, especially trans women of color. There's also the need to decriminalize essentially what we call the loitering for the purpose of prostitution in New York. It's something that's criminalized, but has really been commonly known as the walking while trans ban, because trans women of color are out on the street just walking from place to place, and they get arrested and booked for loitering for the purpose of prostitution. And so it's been a horrible thing to witness, and we need to decriminalize sex work in order to protect people.
Being a public defender for as long as you have, I'm wondering, for all the different cases that you've worked, and I believe there was a time, or there have been times where you've worked a lot of night shifts while being a public defender. When was that moment? Can you take me back to the moment or moments where you concluded or really thought that this being run for Manhattan District Attorney and be a candidate for it? What was that one moment or a couple of moments where you thought, this is what I have to do? Like, this was the moment where I need to become the next district attorney in Manhattan. Was there a moment? Did it happen in court, being a public defender? Take me through that moment where you thought, this is what I have to do now.
Well, I can't say there was one specific moment. I think it was kind of one of those things that just built up and built up and built up, where I was so heartbroken and frustrated and angry about the system and about the way that it operated and about what Cy Vance's office did to perpetuate this cruel, unjust criminal legal system. But I think that it started, very early on. And I mean, over the course of the last decade, I have represented over 3,000 people charged with crimes in this city. But I remember one night, I think it was probably my first year as a public defender in 2009. And I walked into night court and I met a man who had, just like all my clients, had been arrested within the last 24 hours. And I'll call him John for the purposes of this story. And he had worked as a assistant manager at a Gristedes, a grocery store in Lower Manhattan, and he'd worked at the same Gristedes for 25 years. He'd made his way up to assistant manager. And one night he was leaving the store. It was 11 o'clock at night. He was closing up for the night. He had bought 2 bags of groceries with his employee discount, and he got on the A train to head back uptown to his home to bring his food home to his family. And he set the groceries on the seats next to him in the uncrowded subway car and settled in for his long ride home. And at the 125th Street stop, 2 uniformed NYPD officers got on the train. They grabbed his groceries and dumped them to the ground, and they placed John in handcuffs and took him to jail for the night for the crime of occupying multiple seats on a transit facility. And yeah, I met him the next night. I got him out of jail. But for over 10 years, that frustration, that heartbreak, that anger has never gone away, because in seeing people, in defending moms and dads and sons and daughters and sisters and brothers, and watching people be jailed and bullied for as little as taking up 2 seats on the subway, I've just come up against this system that was systematically designed to disenfranchise so many people. And I realized that we really can't change the system unless we change the DA. And so that's why I decided to run for Manhattan District Attorney and change the way that we operate, where the prime beneficiaries are these rich, powerful, and well-connected. And it's no coincidence, because the system has been operated and implemented by an elite, entrenched politician, and that's what we get out of it. So we need to change that.
To be someone who not only is a voice for so many people who have complained about these situations like that and have not been heard, that these instances do happen, to be someone who is a voice and who is a defender for the people who have been disenfranchised and marginalized is something that I can't thank you enough, because, having those situations happen, as you mentioned with John, I know people who have had similar instances where everyday things that they do, or very petty crimes or no crime, turns into them being imprisoned, and then staying in the system because they don't have the money to post bail. And I'm sure so many people can relate to that, whether it's themselves, family member, a friend of a friend, kind of that 6 degrees situation, with so many people who have been caught up in the system for situations like that. It does exist. It does exist. And to have you talk about that with us is something that it is indispensable. Even though we are a sports related show, this hits everybody. And my apologies for the inelegant segue, but I know you're a big sports fan. I know you're a big New York Giants fan, and big with Syracuse University, of course, our alma mater. With sports being at a standstill, I'll get you out on this. I guess, what are you looking forward to the most if and when sports comes back? So I'm just sticking with sports, unless you want to take it off of sports, but what are you most looking forward to in coming back sports wise, and which teams or players you're looking to root for and hope they possibly win a championship for your mood of being a sports fan elevated? So anything you're looking forward to from a sports related perspective when it comes back?
Oh man, that's I mean, I just want everyone to stay safe and healthy and make sure they don't come back before, I don't want anybody to be put at risk, as much as I very deeply love the New York Football Giants and the Syracuse Orange, and would love to see them back. I mean, I hope that, fingers crossed for college basketball season. That was always my favorite. And so I love rooting on Cuse.
A lot of Cuse alums and people who are former Big East fans and current ACC fans can definitely agree with you and feel you on rooting for Cuse. And Eliza Orlins, public defender, Manhattan District Attorney candidate in 2021. She is running for Manhattan District Attorney. For more information or to donate to her campaign, it is Eliza Orlins, ElizaOrlins.com. Is there any other way that other people can find out about you and your campaign or yourself in general before you go?
The website's great. Go to ElizaOrlins.com, sign up for our email list, donate, volunteer, and spread the message. Tell your friends. I'm also Eliza Orlins on Twitter, eOrlins on Instagram, and Eliza Orlins for NY, FORNY on Facebook.
Eliza Orlins, thank you so very much for joining us. It has been wonderful catching up with you, and I definitely hope that we catch up soon, and I hope that we have fun and safely have fun at a Syracuse University basketball game in this area, New York City area soon. And thank you so much for the work that you do and have done over the past decade plus. It has been indispensable. So many people are grateful for the work that you've done, for the voice that you have had in terms of shining a light on this justice system, which, as you said, is working the way it has been set up. It's the setup that has been and that has always been crooked. So, Eliza, thank you so very much for joining us. And again, best of luck and success with your work as a public defender and for your candidacy for Manhattan District Attorney. Eliza, thank you for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.